Joining me now is the mayor of South Bend, Indiana, who is technically still exploring a presidential bid, Pete Buttigieg. Mr. Mayor, welcome back. Welcome to Meet the Press.
Thanks for having me on.
We say exploring. I know you have an announcement prepared, I think, a week from today.
That's right, in South Bend. We're looking forward to it.
Is there any reason to believe that it will be I'm not running for president?
You know, the kind of thing we're going to announce is the kind of thing you only get to announce once. So I hope a lot of friends and supporters will be there a week from today in South Bend.
All right. So what does something completely different mean? And I say this in this respect. Donald Trump came in as the most inexperienced president in American history when it came to government service, public service, and things like that. While you have more executive experience than he did going into this, you also would be a fairly inexperienced president. Why should something completely different be another inexperienced politician?
Well, I would stack up my experience against anybody. I know it's not as traditional. I haven't been marinating in Washington here for a very long time, and I'm not part of that same establishment. But I would argue that being a mayor of a city of any size means that you have to deal with the kinds of issues that really hit Americans. It's everything from infrastructure to economic development to racial sensitivities in policing, not to mention the fact that I would also have more military experience under my belt than anybody to walk into that office since George H.W. Bush. So I think it's about quality as well as quantity in experience. But, you know, I think you can also see pretty clearly that I'm about as different from this president as it gets.
Had you been successful in your last campaign, you'd be the chair of the Democratic Party right now. I assume that means you wouldn't be running for president.
That's probably true. Maybe in a selfish way that worked out for the best.
Well, I was just going to say then, what was your motivation for being DNC chair, and then suddenly you didn't get it and you said, oh, now I should run for president?
Well, I believe any time you're contemplating running for office, the discernment process should work like this. You look at what the office calls for in that moment, and then you look at yourself and what you bring to the table, and you look for a match. And I've used that process to decide to run for office several times. I've used that process to decide not to run for office several times. What I see right now is a country going through tectonic, profound change, and an office that has a loss of vision and a loss of decency. And I'm as surprised as anybody. I mean, if you had asked me 2 years ago what I would be doing in 2019, I don't think I would have said this. But here you have this moment, probably the only moment in American history, where it just might make sense for somebody my age, coming from experience in the industrial Midwest, non-federal, different background, bringing something that will actually help Americans envision the world as it'll be in 2054, the year that I will reach the current age of the current president, and just change the channel from this mesmerizing horror show that's going on in Washington right now.
I want to delve into Indiana a little bit, your record in South Bend and your record in Indiana politics. You ran statewide once in Indiana.
Right.
You ran against a guy named Richard Murdoch, who people in Washington may remember that name. He was the person that upset Dick Lugar, who ended up handing a Senate seat to the Democrats that has since gone Republican. You lost to Murdoch. You got walloped by him.
That's right. It was 2000.
You couldn't win statewide in Indiana.
It was 2010. It's hard for a Democrat to win statewide in the best of years. I was running in the worst of years, but I'm still proud of our campaign. I was largely doing it to stand up for auto workers. You know, Richard Murdoch intervened to prevent the auto rescue. He took a case all the way to the Supreme Court using his standing as Indiana State Treasurer, and it would have devastated our state. I thought somebody needed to stand up to him. I did. I got my head handed to me.
What did you learn from that, though? You obviously had a whole bunch of voters that weren't ready to support you. What do you think your issue was? You think it simply was youth, perhaps?
Well, first of all, again, it was, I actually can say I led the ticket, although just about all of us were somewhere in the 40% range that year, because it's just a horrible year to be a Democrat in Indiana, or frankly in most places. But what I really learned was campaigning. It was my first time on the ballot. It was uphill, to say the least. Not a lot of people were even following the treasurer's race. It's hard when people have heard of neither you nor the office you're running for, but I learned fundraising, I learned retail, I learned how to put a message together, and that wound up serving me very well when in South Bend the seat opened up. It was the first open seat in 24 years, at exactly the moment when our city was looking for something different and needed a fresh start.
I'm going to put up a couple of numbers here having to do with South Bend. The poverty rate is still over 25%. The eviction rate, 6.7%, which is fairly high. Not the highest in Indiana, but on the high end of Indiana.
Right.
Obviously, you've been reelected.
Yeah.
So voters believe you've put the city in the right direction in that sense. But these are still tough numbers. What haven't you been able to accomplish that you wish you would?
Well, there's so much work to do in a community like ours. I think people know that it's the hometown of Notre Dame. They might assume that it's a wealthy, homogenous college town, but we're a city that was devastated by the loss of industry, especially when the auto factories left in the 1960s. When I took office, there were articles about whether South Bend was a dying city. Our poverty rate is too high, but it's down. We cut unemployment by more than half, and we've been able to change the trajectory of the city to where we're growing in population and in investment at a pace we haven't seen in a generation. It's not like all of our problems are solved, but I think one of the reasons that I wound up getting reelected with 80% of the vote is a sense that we had really changed the story for our city. And I think that's something that the country needs to hear, because you got a president who's telling anybody from a community like mine, be it an industrial community or a rural community, any community where people grow up getting this message that success means you have to get out, he's telling us that greatness is in the past, that we've got to stop the clock and turn it back. And I'm out there making the case that South Bend is living proof that a good politics is not one based on the word again.
The issue of income inequality, particularly racial disparities on income inequality, are huge in South Bend. So you've faced, this is a crisis around the country, you faced this firsthand. How much, you haven't had much luck closing that gap. What have you tried that has worked, and what do you think you tried that didn't work?
Well, we've got it moving in the right direction, but we're talking about generational poverty, generational dispossession that is a result of a combination of racist policies over the years and the effect that poverty and mass incarceration have. We're a community where about 25% African American, about 45% non-white, and a lot of people in their lives, in their neighborhoods, it's almost as though the economic recovery we're experiencing right now never even happened. Here's what we think is working. We're investing in neighborhoods that have been historically disinvested in everything from parks and public spaces to supporting entrepreneurship. We opened a small business resource center in an area that was not getting the kind of attention that it needed, because we know that entrepreneurship will empower not just minority business owners, but minority employees. We're taking steps to deal with the eviction rate, as you showed. A lot of times simply having access to legal representation makes all the difference for somebody facing eviction. And we made sure that our neighborhoods were improved, because the issue of blight and vacant and abandoned properties was harming neighbors, especially in minority neighborhoods. People didn't think it could be done, but we dealt with 1,000 houses in 1,000 days by marshaling resources, concentrating them, and working to fix the problem.
I want to ask you about something more thematically. You said in 2015, sort of in the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement, that there needs to be racial reconciliation.
Yes.
Where does that responsibility lie, and what have you done to try to lead a conversation on this?
Well, it lies with all of us. Of course, if you're a mayor of a diverse city, one of the flashpoints for this is in the relationship between communities of color and the police department. So we worked hard on civil rights training, on implicit bias training, but also on getting our police officers to have almost the mentality of city council members, to encourage them to do foot patrols, to walk the neighborhoods, to show up not just when there's an emergency, but when there's a fun fair or a church event or a block party, trying to really thicken those relationships. A lot of it's quantity time, and whenever we've had a moment or an incident that has threatened to divide us racially in our city, we've made sure that we invest in the face time that it takes to reestablish trust. But at the end of the day, people need to see results. That's how trust is built. And it's one of the things I worry about right now nationally, is that you have folks in charge of the government who almost believe as a matter of principle in destroying it. And then when you don't have results, when you don't see people's lives getting better, it further motivates people to want to burn the house down.
Last month, some ICE agents arrested 2 of your constituents in South Bend. What do you make of the idea of the abolish ICE movement that is some people on the progressive end of the spectrum have called for? And I know it's illegal to be a sanctuary city in Indiana, but Gary has pushed the envelope. Why haven't you?
So we have worked very hard to be a welcoming city, because the current immigration policies are just wrong. People who are really important parts of our community are being torn apart from their families, and this is not making us safer. It is not making us stronger. Now, when it comes to ICE, I don't care what the agency in charge of our immigration and border enforcement is called. I care what it does. And as long as you have an agency, even if you get rid of ICE and called it something else, being ordered to tear families apart from one another, or being ordered to make it harder to get on a path to citizenship, you're going to continue to have heartbreaking stories that are not helping anybody, whether we're talking about the undocumented immigrants concerned or whether you're talking about the communities that they're part of.
I want to move a little bit to where you stand in the party. I want you heard Joe Biden. He said, boy, the definition of progressive now seems to be changing. He says, now it's about whether you're a socialist or what's a real progressive. And I know you've been somebody who's trying to push back on this whole labeling issue, but put yourself on the spectrum here. What should Democrats see in you? What do you want Democrats to see in you ideologically?
Well, I think I'm a progressive, but I also think the ideological
capitalist?
analysis. What's that?
You're
Sure.
a capitalist?
Yeah, I think, look, America is a capitalist society, but it's got to be democratic capitalism. And that part's really important, and it's slipping away from us. In other words, when capitalism comes into tension with democracy, which is more important to you? I believe democracy is more important. And when you have capitalism capturing democracy, when you have the kind of regulatory capture where powerful corporations are able to arrange the rules for their benefit, that's not real capitalism. If you want to see what happens when you have capitalism without democracy, you can see it very clearly in Russia. It turns into crony capitalism, and that turns into oligarchy. So I know the temptation, especially for the commentariat, is to kind of align everybody as dots on a spectrum, right. But that's not how most voters think. I mean, think of the number of voters, just mathematically, in St. Joe County, Indiana, who must have voted for Obama and Trump and Mike Pence and me. So there's a lot more to this than an ideological analysis, especially with the ideology in our country so scrambled. Having a president who doesn't even have an ideology, just a style, undertaking a hostile takeover of the Republican Party, while the Democratic Party has only been able to explain its ideological commitments by comparing itself to the Republicans for the better part of my lifetime.
You said something rather strong about the president, that you said it's hard to look at his actions and believe that they are the actions of somebody who believes in God. How do you square that assessment with the fact that the evangelical Christian community is so devoted to his candidacy?
Well, it's something that really frustrates me because the hypocrisy is unbelievable. Here you have somebody who not only acts in a way that is not consistent with anything that I hear in Scripture or in church, where it's about lifting up the least among us and taking care of strangers, which is another word for immigrants, and making sure that you're focusing your effort on the poor, but also personally how you're supposed to conduct yourself. Not chest-thumping, look-at-meism, but humbling yourself before others. Foot washing is one of the central images in the New Testament. And we see the diametric opposite of that in this presidency. I think there was perhaps a cynical process where he decided to, for example, begin to pretend to be pro-life and govern accordingly, which was good enough to bring many evangelicals over to his side. But even on the version of Christianity that you hear from the religious right, which is about sexual ethics, right. I can't believe that somebody who was caught writing hush money checks to adult film actresses is somebody they should be lifting up as the kind of person you want to be leading this nation.
You grew up in arguably the most famous Catholic town in the country. Mm-hmm. I'm curious on abortion. I know what your position is, but how do you have a conversation about it? You're in a community that is extraordinarily divided on this.
Yes.
On this issue. You have pro-life Democrats that don't necessarily get courted nationally anymore.
Right.
How do you square that? And what is your definition? When does life begin? And is there any role for government in abortion?
So as someone who's pro-choice, but who has many friends and even supporters who view this issue very differently than I do, I think it begins by having some measure of good faith and understanding that people arrive at their convictions on this, often from a deeply felt and sincerely held place. But in my view, this is a question that is almost unknowable. This is a moral question. It's not going to be settled by science. Right. And so the best way for it to be settled in practice is by the person who actually faces the choice. And when a woman is facing this decision in her life, I think in terms of somebody besides her who can most be useful in that, the answer to that would be a doctor, not a male government official imposing his interpretation of his religion. All
right, and the final question I want to ask you about was Second Amendment. You come from a Second Amendment state, some might argue, whatever that means to folks. Do you think the Second Amendment, as it's written, prevents gun control the way the Supreme Court says it does?
I don't think it has to, because we've already decided within the framework of the Second Amendment that we're going to draw a line somewhere, right? Shall not be infringed clearly doesn't mean that you're entitled to a nuclear weapon. I mean, somewhere in between a slingshot and a nuclear weapon, we're going to draw a line about what makes sense. In the same way that my right to free speech doesn't include yelling fire in a crowded theater, in the same way that, as one Supreme Court justice said, my right to swing my fist ends where somebody else's nose begins, there are common sense limits that a thinking society can live by while making sure that we honor the lifestyle of sporting, which is where so many family bonds are created and just a deep part of our tradition, and the idea that people should be equipped to defend themselves if they need to.
Unfortunately, I have to leave it there, but Pete Buttigieg, thanks for being on. Stay safe on the trail, and I look forward to asking you more questions. We didn't get much to foreign policy, some other issues, but
Sounds good. I'll
it's
take
going to be
that
a long
as an invite.
campaign. It is an invite. I'll see you soon, I hope.